The flashbulbs were blinding, a frantic, silent storm erupting on the courthouse steps. This wasn't just a divorce. It was a public execution. Grant Lancaster, the titan of industry, stood tall, his arm wrapped possessively around his new life. Isabella Vance, a model half his age, her own slight baby bump, a defiant statement. They were the picture of a scandalous future. Then another car arrived. From it emerged Victoria Lancaster, 7 months pregnant, her face a mask of quiet dignity. The crowd murmured. She looked broken alone. But clutched in her hand like a holy text was a simple leather-bound file, an inheritance from a forgotten man, and a secret that was about to burn the entire Lancaster empire to the ground. The courtroom was a study in cold power. Polished mahogany reflected the merciless fluorescent lights, and the air, thick with the scent of expensive cologne and simmering animosity, felt heavy enough to choke on. This was Grant Lancaster's natural habitat, an arena where victory was not just expected, but preordained. He sat at the plaintiff's table, a portrait of bespoke arrogance in a Tom Ford suit that probably cost more than the average person's car. His posture was relaxed, almost bored, as if the entire proceeding was a minor inconvenience, a bit of distasteful housekeeping before he could officially move on. Beside him, Isabella Vance was his perfect curated accessory. Her blonde hair was a flawless sheet of silk, her makeup impeccable. She kept a manicured hand resting on her barely there baby bump, a constant theatrical reminder of her claim. Every so often she would lean in and whisper something in Grant's ear, a small triumphant smile playing on her lips as she glanced across the room at the woman she was replacing. She was a conquest, a symbol of Grant's virility and enduring power, and she played her part with relish. Across the aisle sat Victoria Lancaster. To the casual observer, she was a stark, sorrowful contrast. Her simple dark blue maternity dress was elegant but understated, chosen for comfort, not for combat. Her brown hair was tied back in a simple knot, and she wore no makeup. The sleepless nights and the stress of the past few months had etched faint lines of exhaustion around her eyes, but they had not extinguished the fire within them. That fire was now a low-banked ember, preserved for the fight to come. She was 7 months pregnant, and the gentle, protective way she held one hand over her stomach spoke of a battle far more important than the one being waged in this room. The object that drew the most covert glances, however, was the worn leather-bound document file on the table in front of her. It was old, its corners softened with age, the initials AR faintly embossed in gold leaf on its cover. It looked out of place amidst the crisp legal pads and gleaming pens, a relic from another time. It was Victoria's only weapon. Grant's lawyer, Marcus Thorne, rose to his feet. Thorne was a shark in human form, renowned in New York legal circles for his scorched earth tactics. He had a face like a clenched fist, and a voice that could strip paint from walls. "Your Honor," Thorne began, his voice booming with practiced condescension, "we are here today to expedite a matter of unfortunate but necessary separation. My client, Mr. Grant Lancaster, has been more than generous. He is prepared to offer Mrs. Lancaster a one-time settlement of $5 million, a clean break to dissolve this regrettable union." A collective gasp, quickly suppressed, rippled through the pews where the press and spectators sat. $5 million. To the world, it was a fortune. To the wife of a man whose net worth was estimated to be in the tens of billions, it was a profound insult. It was a nuisance fee to make her disappear. Thorne continued, turning his gaze on Victoria. "This amount is frankly magnanimous, considering Mrs. Lancaster brought no significant assets into the marriage. She was a librarian, Your Honor. A respectable, if modest, profession. Mr. Lancaster elevated her to a world she could only have dreamed of. This settlement will allow her to return to a comfortable life, a life more suited to her station." Every word was a precisely aimed dart intended to diminish her, to paint her as a gold digger who had hit the jackpot and was now being justly put back in her place. Victoria could feel the weight of 100 pairs of eyes on her, feel their judgment. She saw Grant smirk, a cold, dismissive curl of his lips. He was enjoying this. He wanted to break her not just legally, but spiritually. Victoria's lawyer, Clara Hayes, stood. She was the opposite of Thorne in every way. younger, sharper, with an intensity that burned where thorns blustered. She was a rising star in family law, known for taking on cases the big firms wouldn't touch. "Your Honor." Clara's voice was calm and clear, cutting through the toxic atmosphere Thorne had created. "My client rejects this magnanimous offer." Thorne chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. "On what grounds, delusion? This is a prenuptial agreement signed and sealed. It's ironclad. She is entitled to $1 million for every year of the marriage. It has been 5 years. My client is offering exactly that. There is nothing to contest." "We are not here to contest the prenuptial agreement, Mr. Thorne," Clara said, her eyes locking onto his. "We are here to contest the very foundation upon which that agreement was built. We are here to contest the ownership of the marital assets themselves." A confused murmur spread through the room. Grant for the first time shifted in his seat. His look of bored arrogance flickered, replaced by a glint of irritation. What was this new-minted lawyer playing at, Thorne scoffed? And what could possibly be the basis for such an audacious claim? Does Mrs. Lancaster now believe she co-founded Lancaster Global from her library desk? The gallery tittered. Victoria felt a flush of heat rise to her cheeks, but she met Grant's gaze across the courtroom. His eyes were cold, daring her. "You have nothing," they seemed to say. "You are nothing without me." Clara Hayes let the laughter die down. She then walked over to her client's table and gently placed her hand on the old leather file. "No, Mr. Thorne," Clara said, her voice dropping, drawing everyone in. "My client makes no such claim, but this file does." She lifted the file so the judge could see it clearly. "This is the personal ledger and final inheritance of my client's late grandfather, Mr. Arthur Reed, and its contents will prove with irrefutable documentation that the entirety of the Lancaster family fortune, the seed from which Lancaster Global grew, was systematically and illegally stolen from Arthur Reed. Therefore, the assets Mr. Lancaster is so magnanimously offering to split are not and have never been his to give. They belong to his wife." Silence. It was absolute. The kind of silence that is so profound it feels like a physical pressure. The reporters in the back forgot how to breathe. Marcus Thorne's jaw, for the first time in his professional career, hung slightly agape. Isabella's perfect smile had vanished, replaced by a mask of utter confusion as she looked from Victoria to Grant. And Grant Lancaster, the master of the universe, the man who controlled boardrooms and bent markets to his will, stared at his pregnant wife. The color had drained from his face. The name Arthur Reed was a ghost from a past he thought long buried and forgotten. And in Victoria's eyes he no longer saw a heartbroken woman he could easily discard. He saw the ghost of her grandfather, and for the first time in his life Grant Lancaster felt a tremor of pure, unadulterated fear. The file sat on the table between them, no longer a relic but a ticking bomb. And the fuse had just been lit. The judge, a seasoned and unflappable woman named Eleanor Vance, no relation to Isabella. A fact that brought a grim smile to Victoria's face, called for an immediate recess and an in-chambers meeting. The courtroom doors had barely swung shut before Grant's facade of calm shattered. "What is this, Victoria?" He hissed, his voice a low, dangerous growl as he strode towards her, ignoring the restraining hand of his lawyer. "What pathetic little game are you playing? My father was a visionary. Your grandfather was a nobody, a bookkeeper." Victoria stood her ground, her hand never leaving her stomach. "My grandfather was a brilliant man who trusted the wrong people. He trusted your father, Grant. He thought Alistair Lancaster was his partner." Partners. Grant laughed, a harsh, ugly sound that echoed in the now empty room. "My father built an empire from nothing. Your grandfather was a salaried employee, a clerk who got lucky enough to be in the right room at the right time." "Then you'll have no problem with the contents of this file, will you?" Clara Hayes interjected, stepping between them. "If it's all just the fantasy of a nobody, then you have nothing to fear." Marcus Thorne finally found his voice, pulling Grant back. "Don't engage, Grant. This is a stunt. A desperate last-ditch attempt to extort a larger settlement. Forgery, emotional distress? We'll bury them. But the bravado in Thorne's voice was hollow. He had seen the look on Grant's face when he'd heard Arthur Reed's name. It wasn't the look of a man facing a frivolous lawsuit. It was the look of a man seeing a ghost walk through the door. As they were escorted into the judge's chambers, Victoria's mind drifted back. Not to the screaming matches and cold silences that had defined the last year of her marriage, but further back. To a quiet, sun-drenched porch and the gentle, steady presence of her grandfather. Flashback. 10 years earlier. Arthur Reed's hands, though wrinkled and spotted with age, were surprisingly strong and steady as he repaired the spine of an old copy of Moby Dick. He had a scent of old paper pipe tobacco and integrity. Victoria, then a college student home for the summer, sat with him watching. A man's ledger is his legacy, Victoria, he'd said, not looking up from his work. It's more than numbers. It's a story of his promises, his failures, and his triumphs. Victoria had been in love then, not with Grant, but with the idea of love itself. She'd met Grant Lancaster a few months prior at a university fundraiser. He was a guest speaker, a dynamic, handsome heir to a global fortune. She was a volunteer, a scholarship student shelving books. He had sought her out, charmed by what he called her quiet intelligence and unspoiled nature. He was unlike anyone she had ever met, confident, worldly, and utterly captivated by her. It felt like a fairy tale. She had told her grandfather about him, her voice full of breathless wonder. Arthur had listened patiently, his kind eyes searching her face. Lancaster, he'd murmured the name, tasting like ash in his mouth. Alistair Lancaster's boy. You know him? Victoria had asked, surprised. I knew his father. Arthur had said, his voice flat. He set the book aside and looked out at the garden. We were associates. A long time ago. A shadow had passed over her grandfather's face, a flicker of ancient pain so profound that it silenced Victoria's happy chatter. He never spoke of it again, but a week before he passed away 2 years later, he had called her to his bedside. His breathing was shallow, his body frail, but his mind was as sharp as ever. He'd pressed the leather-bound file into her hands. It was heavier than it looked. This is my real ledger, Victoria, he'd whispered, his voice raspy. Not the numbers I was paid, but the ones I was owed. Everything in here is the truth, a truth Alistair Lancaster buried under a mountain of money and lies. Grandpa, what is it? She'd asked, her eyes welling with tears. It's insurance. Your insurance. That young man you're so taken with. Grant. He is his father's son. A Lancaster always collects, they never pay. They see people as assets or liabilities. Right now you're an asset, but the day they decide you're a liability, they will try to erase you. He coughed, a deep rattling sound. Don't open it unless you have to. Live your life. Be happy. But if the day comes when you have your back against the wall, when they try to take everything from you and tell you that you are nothing, you open this file, and you let the truth speak for me. He died 2 days later. Victoria, deeply in love and on the verge of getting engaged, had put the file away in a safe deposit box, the warning feeling like the ramblings of a dying man clinging to an old grudge. She had believed in Grant's love. She had believed she was different. Present day. The judge's chambers. The chambers were small and suffocating. Judge Vance sat behind a large oak desk, her face stern and unreadable. Ms. Hayes, she said, her voice cutting straight to the point. You have made an extraordinary claim. I hope for your client's sake you have extraordinary evidence to back it up. We do, Your Honor, Clara said calmly. She placed the file on the judge's desk and opened it. The pages inside were not filled with dense, incomprehensible legal text. They were a meticulous chronicle. The first section contained a detailed business plan dated 1975 for a diversified import-export company focusing on emerging Asian markets. The level of detail was staggering: market analysis, logistical frameworks, 5- and 10-year growth projections. The name at the top of the plan was Reed and Lancaster Holdings. Grant let out a strangled noise. This is ridiculous. It's a fantasy. Clara ignored him, turning to the next page. It was a signed partnership agreement. A simple one-page document signed by Arthur Reed and Alistair Lancaster agreeing to a 50-50 split in a new joint venture. Alistair, the son of a moderately successful factory owner, provided the initial modest capital. Arthur, the financial prodigy, provided the intellect, the strategy, and the connections he had cultivated as a top-level financial analyst. My client's grandfather architected the entire strategy that became the foundation of the Lancaster fortune, Clara explained. Alistair Lancaster was meant to be the face, the front man. Arthur Reed was the brain. A forged document, Thorne boomed. Worthless. Is it? Clara flipped to the next section. It contained years of correspondence. Carbon copies of letters from Arthur to Alistair outlining strategies, warning of market shifts, celebrating early successes. And then the tone began to change. Letters from Arthur asking about profit sharing, about formalizing the corporate structure as promised. The replies from Alistair when they came were increasingly evasive. The centerpiece of the file was a smaller sealed envelope. Inside was a sworn affidavit signed and notarized in 1982 by a man named George Maxwell, the first chief financial officer of the newly incorporated Lancaster Enterprises. In the affidavit, a guilt-ridden Maxwell confessed that he had, under duress from Alistair Lancaster, created 2 sets of books. One showed the true partnership. The other erased Arthur Reed, completely reclassifying his initial strategic contributions as a simple one-time consulting fee, which was paid and documented to look official. But the final pages were the most damning. They were stock certificates. Not for Lancaster Enterprises, but for 3 obscure holding companies based in Switzerland and the Cayman Islands. Arthur, realizing he was being pushed out, had cleverly made sure that some of the initial critical patents for logistical software he had designed were registered not to the company, but to these offshore entities he secretly controlled. He had never touched them. He had let them sit dormant for 40 years. Financial time bombs. Clara Hayes slid a final document across the desk to the judge. It was a recent valuation from a forensic accounting firm. According to our analysis, Your Honor, those dormant patents which are integral to Lancaster Global's entire shipping and logistics division have matured. The holding companies that own them are by proxy now entitled to a controlling interest in that division, a division which accounts for roughly 40% of Lancaster Global's total valuation. She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. The inheritance Mr. Reed left for his granddaughter isn't just about reclaiming the past. It's about taking control of the present. He didn't just leave her a claim to old money, he left her the keys to the kingdom. Judge Vance slowly finished reading the summary. She took off her glasses and rubbed the bridge of her nose, the only sign of her shock. She looked at Grant Lancaster, who was now ashen-faced and visibly trembling. He wasn't looking at the judge or the lawyers. He was staring at Victoria, at the woman he had tried to discard like trash. The fairy tale was over. The story her grandfather told wasn't a rambling memory. It was a prophecy. And Victoria, the quiet librarian, was no longer a liability to be erased. She was the rightful heir. The courtroom battle for $5 million was irrelevant. The real war had just begun, and it was for the entire $40 billion Lancaster empire. Leaving the judge's chambers was like stepping from the eye of a storm back into the hurricane. Judge Vance had placed a temporary injunction on all of Grant's personal and corporate assets pending an emergency evidentiary hearing. The news leaked by a clerk within minutes sent shockwaves through the financial world. Lancaster Global's stock ticker, visible on a screen in the courthouse lobby, was already a waterfall of red. The Grant who emerged was not the same man who had walked in. The mask of cool indifference was gone, replaced by a rictus of raw fury. He saw Victoria and Clara Hayes standing by the elevators, and for a moment it looked as if he might physically charge at them. "You think you can get away with this?" He snarled, his voice low and venomous, heedless of the reporters straining to hear. A box of dusty papers and a dead man's lies. I will ruin you, Victoria. I will spend every last dollar I have to prove this is a fraud. I will drag your grandfather's name through the mud. By the time I'm done, the world will see you as nothing but a pathetic, vindictive thief. Victoria met his gaze, her own quiet strength, a stark contrast to his explosive rage. The truth doesn't need to be defended, Grant. It just needs to be told. His threat, however, was not idle. Within hours, the full might of the Lancaster public relations machine was unleashed. It was a brutal, overwhelming assault. The narrative was spun with vicious precision. Victoria was painted as an unstable, scorned woman. Anonymous sources close to the family began leaking stories to tabloids and gossip websites. They claimed Victoria had a history of emotional problems, that she had grown increasingly erratic during the pregnancy. They whispered that she was being manipulated by her predatory lawyer, Clara Hayes, who was using a grieving pregnant woman to make a name for herself. Isabella Vance became the public face of this campaign. She gave a tearful exclusive interview to a major television network. I just don't understand how she could be so cruel, Isabella said, dabbing her eyes with a tissue, her hand protectively on her stomach. Grant loved her. He gave her everything. And now, this. To attack his family's legacy, to attack his father's memory, it's monstrous. All we want is to move on and start our family in peace. This stress, it's not good for the baby. She was brilliant. She framed herself and Grant as the victims, a young family under attack by a bitter ex-wife. The court of public opinion swayed by a pretty face, and a tragic story began to turn. The comments on social media were a torrent of hatred directed at Victoria. Justice for Grant began trending. Grant, meanwhile, was fighting back on the legal front. He hired a team of high-powered forensic document examiners from a firm in London, tasking them with discrediting every page of Arthur Reed's file. He filed a countersuit against Victoria for defamation and fraud, seeking astronomical damages. He was trying to bury her in legal fees, to bleed her dry emotionally and financially before she could even get to the main hearing. The pressure on Victoria was immense. Her phone buzzed incessantly with notifications of new articles, each one a fresh stab. Old acquaintances called not to offer support, but to awkwardly pry for information. She felt isolated, besieged. The world Grant had brought her into, the world of galas and high society, had turned on her with a vengeance. They were closing ranks, protecting one of their own against the outsider. One evening, sitting alone in the small apartment she had rented after leaving the penthouse, Victoria felt a moment of despair. The baby kicked a strong, reassuring thump against her ribs, as if sensing her fear. She placed her hand on the spot, tears welling in her eyes. Was her grandfather right? Was she strong enough to see this through? Clara Hayes arrived an hour later, carrying 2 large bags of takeout and a file of her own. She found Victoria staring out the window at the city lights, the city that felt like it was trying to swallow her whole. Don't read the comments, Clara said, her voice gentle but firm, as she started unpacking containers of soup and bread onto the coffee table. That's what they want. They want to isolate you, make you feel like you're crazy. It's a classic narcissist tactic. It's called a smear campaign. It's working, Victoria whispered. They all believe him. They think I'm a monster. The people who matter don't, Clara said, handing her a bowl of soup. The judge doesn't, and I don't. Now eat. You're fighting for 2 now. After they ate, Clara opened her own file. Grant's strategy is predictable. He's attacking the evidence because he can't attack the facts. His team is going to claim the partnership agreement is a forgery. The letters are fabricated and the affidavit was coerced. They're going to paint George Maxwell as a disgruntled employee with an axe to grind. But it's the truth, Victoria insisted. Truth isn't always enough in a courtroom. We need to corroborate it. We need something they can't spin. Something current. Clara leaned forward, her eyes bright with intensity. Victoria, think. Your grandfather. Did he ever mention anyone else from that time? Another partner, a secretary, a junior associate, someone who might still be alive. someone who knew the truth about him and Alistair. Lancaster. Victoria racked her brain. Her grandfather had been a private man, especially about his past. He rarely spoke of his professional life. She remembered names from old stories, but they were ghosts long gone. Then a faint memory surfaced. It wasn't a name, but a complaint. He used to get so frustrated, Victoria said slowly, closing her eyes to picture it. He'd be balancing his checkbook, and he'd mutter about someone named Sal. He'd say, "Sal the gambler still can't get his numbers right." He said Sal was Alistair's cousin, that Alistair gave him a make-work job in the accounting department to keep him out of trouble. Clara's pen was already flying across her notepad. Sal. Salvatore. "Do you know his last name? Petrillo, I think," Victoria said. "Grandpa said Alistair kept him on the payroll for years, even after he retired. Hush money, maybe? Or just family loyalty?" "I don't know." Sal. Petrillo. Clara repeated, a hunter's glint in her eye. "If he was in accounting in the early days and Alistair kept paying him, he might know where the bodies are buried, or in this case, where the ledgers are buried." It was a long shot, a needle in a haystack. But it was more than they had a minute ago. It was a thread, a chance to find a living witness who could cut through the noise and lies of Grant's media machine. A few days later, just as Grant's team publicly released a preliminary report claiming the ink on Arthur's partnership agreement was inconsistent with the purported age of the document, Clara got a hit. Her private investigator had found a Salvatore Petrillo. He was 87 years old, living in a retirement community in Boca Raton, Florida. The race was on. Clara knew that Grant's investigators, if they were any good, would inevitably stumble upon the same name. She had to get to Sal Petrillo first. She had to convince a man who had likely been paid for his silence for over 40 years to finally tell the truth. It was a desperate gambit, but it was the only move she had left. As she booked a last-minute flight to Florida, she knew this trip would either be the key to validating Arthur Reed's legacy or the final nail in the coffin of Victoria's case. The air in the cabin of the southbound flight felt thin and recycled, each breath a reminder of the immense pressure resting on Clara Hayes's shoulders. Below her, the patchwork of America scrolled by indifferent. She ignored the beverage service, her focus entirely on the file open on her lap, a slim collection of notes on one Salvatore Petrillo. It was the longest of long shots, a desperate dive into the past, based on a single half-remembered name muttered by Victoria's grandfather. Grant's PR machine was running at full throttle, successfully painting Victoria as a vindictive fantasist. His team of London experts had just submitted their preliminary findings, a dense, jargon-filled report concluding Arthur Reed's ledger was a fabrication. They were losing. Clara knew it. This trip wasn't just a search for a witness. It was a lifeline. If Sal Petrillo was a dead end or refused to talk, the case was likely over. Victoria's future and the future of her unborn child was riding on this one desperate gambit. Boca Raton was a jarring sensory shift. The brutalist gray of New York was replaced by a riot of pastels and lush tropical green. The air, thick with the sweet scent of hibiscus and the tang of salt, hung heavy and humid. The retirement community was an oasis of tranquility, its manicured perfection, a stark contrast to the turmoil in Clara's soul. She found Sal Petrillo on a shaded lanai overlooking a placid man-made lake where snowy egrets picked their way through the reeds. He was a whisper of a man, thin and bird-like, in a Tommy Bahama shirt, his tanned skin stretched taut over a frail frame. A horse-racing form and a half-finished glass of iced tea sat on the table before him. When Clara introduced herself and stated her purpose, his watery blue eyes, which had been placidly watching the birds, sharpened, with a wariness that was 40 years old. A lawyer, he grunted, his voice a dry rasp. "From New York." "Let me guess. Grant sent you to make sure the old man keeps his mouth shut." He gestured dismissively. "Tell him he's got nothing to worry about. The check's still clear. The deal is the deal." "I'm not his lawyer, Mr. Petrillo," Clara said, taking the seat opposite him. She decided against any legal maneuvering. This man was beyond intimidation or clever tricks. He needed the truth. My name is Clara Hayes. I represent Victoria Lancaster. She paused, letting the name land. Arthur Reed's granddaughter. The effect was instantaneous and profound. Sal flinched as if struck. The cynical mask dissolved, and for a moment his face was a transparent canvas of long-buried emotions, guilt, fear, regret, and a flicker of something that looked achingly like admiration. He set his glass down with a trembling hand. Artie Reed. He murmured the name, an incantation from another lifetime. He stared out at the lake, but he was seeing a ghost. Jesus. Artie. There was a man. A straight arrow in a world of corkscrews. The smartest guy I ever knew, and I knew plenty. He had a brain like one of them new IBM computers. Numbers just sang to him. He shook his head slowly. Alistair. My cousin Alistair. He didn't have that. Alistair had ambition. That's all. Just raw, naked ambition that chewed up everything in its path. But the two of them in the beginning, they were supposed to be unstoppable. Clara sat perfectly still, letting him talk. The dam of silence built over 4 decades was beginning to crack. For the next hour, the story poured out of him. He spoke of the thrilling, frenetic energy of the early 1970s, of late nights fueled by coffee and dreams, with Arthur mapping out global logistics on a chalkboard and Alistair working the phones, his charisma a tangible force. Sal had been brought in to handle the books. And then he described the shift, the subtle poisoning of the partnership. Alistair started calling it his company. Sal recalled his voice thick with shame. He'd say, "My vision, my capital." He couldn't stand that the engine of it all was Artie's brain. He wanted the credit, all of it. He wouldn't look at Clara, his gaze fixed on his gnarled hands. He came to me. Said he had a problem with the partnership structure. Said Artie wasn't pulling his weight on the capital side. It was all lies. Then he made me the offer. Sal, he said, you do these books my way and you'll never have to worry about your bookie again. I had debts. Big ones. I was weak. So I did it. I cooked him a second ledger. A work of art it was. Turned Artie's 50% stake into a one-time consulting fee. Made it look like Artie was a contractor who'd been paid handsomely for his time and then sent on his way. Alistair paid my debts and then he kept paying me. A pension, he called it. It was hush money. And it bought my soul, Mr. Petrillo. Clara said softly. Victoria's case is hanging by a thread. Grant's team is painting her grandfather as a con man. They are trying to destroy his memory. We need you. Would you be willing to testify to what you just told me? Fear immediately flooded back into Sal's eyes. Testify. In court. Are you crazy? Grant is Alistair with the brakes cut. He's ruthless. He would ruin me. Take my pension, smear my name. I'm 87 years old. I just want to die in peace. Is this peace? Clara countered, her voice firm but not unkind. Taking money stained with the betrayal of a good man. They are doing to his granddaughter what his father did to him. They are trying to erase her. Arthur Reed trusted her with the truth, and right now you're the only other person alive who can corroborate it. Sal was quiet for a long time, the gentle lapping of the lake the only sound. He looked down at his racing form, a symbol of the weakness that had cost him his integrity. Then he looked up, his gaze meeting Clara's. A lifetime of regret had come to a head. Artie was good to me, he said, his voice cracking. After Alistair pushed him out, he called me. Said, watch yourself, Sal. Alistair pays in chains. He was right. I've been wearing them for 40 years. A new resolve hardened his features. Okay, I'll do it. For Artie. I'm an old man. What more can they take from me? My good name. I sold that in 1976. I'll sign an affidavit. And if you need me to, I'll get on that stand and look Grant Lancaster right in the eye." Clara felt a wave of relief so profound it almost buckled her. She had the lifeline. But then Sal leaned forward, a conspiratorial, almost mischievous glint in his eye. "But that's not all," he whispered. "There's more. A final joke, something even Artie never knew." Clara's senses went on high alert. "What is it, Sal?" In the early days, Alistair was paranoid about taxes, about creditors. On the advice of some slick lawyer, he decided to hide the company's first major physical asset. It was a big warehouse on the Brooklyn waterfront, a real linchpin for the shipping strategy Artie designed. Alistair had me create an anonymous trust to hold the deed just temporarily. A shell game. But then the company exploded, money was flying everywhere, and the paperwork got buried. The trust was never dissolved. The deed was never officially transferred to Lancaster Enterprises. Clara's heart began to hammer against her ribs. She could barely breathe the question. Who was the beneficiary of the trust, Sal? A slow, grim smile spread across Salvatore Petrillo's face. It was the smile of a man about to deliver a punchline 40 years in the making. Alistair was an arrogant bastard. He wanted a name that could never be traced back to him, a final secret insult to the man he'd cheated, a name he was sure would never come looking. The sole beneficiary of the trust is Arthur Reed. Clara Hayes felt a jolt of pure, unadulterated triumph. She had come to Florida searching for a shield. Sal Petrillo had just handed her a nuclear warhead. That warehouse wasn't just a warehouse anymore. It was the centerpiece of a multi-billion-dollar commercial redevelopment. It wasn't just an asset, it was a crown jewel. Yad. The atmosphere in the courtroom on the day of the evidentiary hearing was electric. Grant and Marcus Thorne sat at their table radiating a smug, dismissive confidence. They had their expert report, they had the media on their side, and they believed they had Victoria cornered. Their London-based document expert testified for nearly an hour via video link, his crisp British accent lending an air of unimpeachable authority as he spoke of anomalous ink saturation, inconsistent paper fiber aging, and modern chemical binders. It was a masterful performance designed to drown the truth in a sea of boring, incomprehensible technicalities. Grant smirked, catching Victoria's eye with a look of pure, triumphant malice. When it was Clara's turn, she rose slowly. "The defense has no questions for this witness, Your Honor." She paused as the expert's face vanished from the screen. "The plaintiff has gone to great lengths and expense to attack the integrity of a 40-year-old file. So instead of arguing about the past with paid experts, let's talk to someone who was actually there." The defense called Salvatore Petrillo to the stand. A confused murmur rippled through the courtroom. "Who?" At the plaintiff's table, Marcus Thorne shuffled his papers, a flicker of annoyance on his face. Grant, however, went rigid. His face, moments before so full of arrogance, turned the color of ash. He knew that name. The courtroom doors opened, and a bailiff wheeled in the frail, elderly man from Florida. The sight of him, small, old, but resolute, sent a visible shockwave through Grant's legal team. They had been completely blindsided. Sal's testimony was riveting. In his quiet, gravelly voice, guided by Clara's gentle questions, he laid the whole sordid story bare. The secret meetings, the two ledgers, the decades of hush money. When Marcus Thorne rose to cross-examine, his voice was dripping with venom. He savaged Sal, bringing up his gambling past, accusing him of blackmail, branding him a senile old man trying to extort money. Sal flinched under the brutal assault, his composure wavering. But then he looked over at Victoria, her pregnant form a symbol of the future her grandfather had tried to protect, and he found his anchor. "I may be old, sir," he said, his voice shaking but clear. "And I made mistakes. Terrible ones. But I'm not lying. Not about this. I'm telling the truth. It's a heavy thing to carry for so long, and my back is getting tired." Thorne sat down, frustrated but confident he had sown enough doubt. But Clara wasn't finished. She rose for her redirect. Just one last thing, Mr. Petrillo, she said, her voice dropping, drawing every ounce of attention in the room. She walked to her table and retrieved a single pristine document from a folder. Can you identify this for the court? She placed the original trust registration in front of him. He peered at it through his thick glasses. Yes, he said. This is the trust I created for Alistair Lancaster in 1976 to hold the deed for the Brooklyn property. And what was the purpose of this trust, Clara asked. To hide the asset from creditors, Sal stated plainly. A temporary shell game. The air grew thick with anticipation. The reporters in the gallery leaned forward, pens poised. Clara took a deep breath. This was it. Mr. Petrillo, can you please read to the court the name listed on line 7 under sole beneficiary? The chamber was utterly silent. Sal Petrillo looked down at the page. He then lifted his head and for the first time looked directly at Grant Lancaster. There was no malice in his eyes, only a profound, weary pity. He leaned into the microphone, his voice resonating with the weight of 4 decades of silence. Arthur Reed. The silence that followed was not empty. It was a physical presence, a thunderclap of shock that sucked the air out of the room. Marcus Thorne's pen slipped from his fingers and clattered onto the hardwood floor, the sound an absurdly loud punctuation mark to their utter defeat. In the front row, Isabella Vance's perfectly composed face transformed. Her eyes darted from Grant's ashen, horror-struck expression to Victoria's calm, resolute one. The calculation was instantaneous and ruthless. The SS Lancaster was sinking. She quietly stood up, and with the practiced grace of a model leaving a catwalk, she slipped out of the courtroom and out of Grant's life. Grant Lancaster sat motionless, seeing nothing. He was a man hollowed out, erased by a ghost's final, brilliant move. The empire was built on a lie, and the proof wasn't in a dusty, debatable ledger. It was in an irrefutable, legally binding trust document, a kill shot fired from the grave. Judge Eleanor Vance looked down from her bench, her face a mask of grim finality. Her gavel came down, the sound cracking through the stunned silence like a rifle shot. In light of this extraordinary and definitive evidence, she declared, her voice ringing with indisputable authority. This court is expanding the injunction. I am ordering a full independent audit of Lancaster Global and all associated holdings past and present. The assets will remain frozen, and a court-appointed receiver will be put in place to oversee all company operations until the matter of the true and rightful ownership of this company is resolved. The fall of the House of Lancaster was not a cataclysmic earthquake, but the slow, inexorable flooding of a great ship. The court-appointed receivers, a quiet army of men and women in unassuming gray suits, moved through the gleaming halls of Lancaster Global with a chilling efficiency. They spoke in hushed tones, their clipboards and laptops serving as instruments of a clinical autopsy on a 40-year-old crime. The atmosphere in the building, once charged with aggressive ambition and fear of its titan leader, was now thick with bewildered silence. Employees who once scurried past Victoria with pitying glances now watched her with a mixture of awe and trepidation when she made her necessary visits, her presence a constant, quiet reminder of the tectonic shift that had occurred beneath their feet. For Grant, the penthouse apartment on Central Park West, once the symbol of his dominion, became a gilded prison. The sweeping views of the city he once considered his kingdom were now a bitter taunt. Surrounded by art he could no longer sell and luxuries that felt hollow, he was a king trapped in an empty castle. His days were a long, agonizing blur of silence. He would watch the financial news channels on mute, the Chiron detailing the systematic dismantling of his life's work. His own face staring back at him from the screen, no longer with a headline of triumph, but of disgrace. Old contacts, men who had begged for his time just months before, no longer answered his calls. His world had shrunk to the confines of those 4 walls. The ultimate humiliation came on a Tuesday night. He watched, stone-faced, as Isabella Vance, his Isabella, gave her tearful prime-time interview. She spoke of his frightening temper, an emotional manipulation, painting herself as an innocent drawn into a web of deceit. She cradled her stomach, reframing the child that was meant to be his heir as her personal cross to bear. Grant felt nothing, not anger, not betrayal, just a profound empty coldness. Her desertion was merely a symptom of the disease he had been afflicted with his entire life, the belief that loyalty could be bought. He now saw with excruciating clarity that all such transactions have an expiration date. Victoria, in stark contrast, was consumed not by the past, but by the future. Her days were filled with meetings not of vengeance, but of construction. Flanked by Clara Hayes and a small hand-picked team of ethical advisors, she pored over financial statements, corporate structures, and legal obligations. The sheer weight of the responsibility was at times overwhelming. This was no windfall. It was a trust passed down through a generation of silence, and she felt the ghost of her grandfather in every decision urging her toward prudence and integrity. She was not just claiming an inheritance, she was assuming a duty. 1 month before her due date, she decided the final thread had to be cut. She arranged a meeting with Grant. Not in a courtroom or a lawyer's office, but in the sterile neutrality of a private suite at a downtown hotel, a place with no memories for either of them. When he walked in, she was struck by how much he had diminished. The powerful aura he had cultivated was gone, stripped away with his authority. The bespoke suit was replaced by a simple cashmere sweater that hung loosely on his frame, and his eyes, once burning with cold fire, were now dull and haunted. The silence stretched between them, thick with the ghosts of their shared past, of laughter in Italian villas, of whispered promises in the dark, and of the final ugly betrayal. "What do you want, Victoria?" he finally asked, his voice raspy, devoid of its signature arrogance. It was the question of a man who had nothing left to bargain with. Victoria looked at the man she had once loved, the man who had tried to crush her, and felt an unexpected wave, not of hatred but of weary finality. Revenge, she realized, would be like chaining herself to his wreckage. "I wanted to look you in the eye," she said, her voice steady and clear. "And I wanted to give you a choice." She slid a thick vellum envelope across the polished table. He opened it with unsteady hands. It was a settlement offer. It outlined the creation of a trust in his name, funded with a sum that would be considered a fortune to anyone else. It was enough for a lifetime of comfort, of quiet luxury, but it was a pittance compared to the empire he'd lost. It was enough to live, but not enough to rule. The terms were absolute. In exchange, he would relinquish all future claims to the company or its assets, formally cede all parental rights to the child she carried, and issue a public letter of apology, not only to her, but posthumously to Arthur Reed. He read it twice, a flicker of disbelief in his eyes. Why, he whispered the question raw with genuine confusion. After everything, why not leave me with nothing? Why not destroy me completely? "Because that's what you would do," Victoria replied, her hand resting protectively on the curve of her belly. "It's what your father did. He left my grandfather with nothing but his integrity. It turns out, that was the most valuable asset of all." She leaned forward slightly, her gaze unwavering. "I am not doing this for you, Grant. I'm doing it for me, and for her." She nodded toward her stomach. "My child will not be raised in a house built on revenge. Her legacy won't be defined by your ruin, but by what we build in its place. This isn't a punishment. It's an ending. Your story with this company, with this family, is over. This is your chance to walk away with a sliver of dignity. It's more than you gave my grandfather." He stared at the signature line, the truth of her words washing over him in a final crushing wave. Her mercy was a more profound statement of her victory than any act of vengeance could ever be. She wasn't just winning. She was rendering him irrelevant. With a shaking hand, he picked up the pen and signed his name, the quiet scratch of the nib, the final sound of his surrender. 2 months later, in the quiet, sterile peace of a hospital room, Victoria Lancaster gave birth to a 7-pound baby girl. As the nurse placed the swaddled infant in her arms, the world of courtrooms, injunctions, and balance sheets dissolved into nothing. Looking into the tiny, perfect face of her daughter, Victoria felt a love so fierce and absolute it eclipsed everything else. This was the reason. This was the prize. She named her Grace. The newly restructured company, Reed Lancaster Legacy Holdings, began its transformation. At the first board meeting, Victoria, with Grace sleeping soundly in a carrier beside her, proposed a radical new charter. They established the Arthur Reed Foundation for Ethical Enterprise. They implemented a company-wide profit-sharing plan ensuring that every employee, from the custodians to the data analysts, had a stake in the company's success. It was a move that baffled the few remaining old guard executives, but it electrified the rest of the company, breathing new life into the cynical corporate culture. One crisp autumn evening, Victoria stood on the terrace of her new home, a warm, inviting brownstone on a tree-lined street, worlds away from Grant's cold glass tower. She held Grace close, the baby's soft breaths a gentle rhythm against her shoulder, and looked out at the glittering tapestry of the city. Her grandfather's words echoed in her mind. "A Lancaster always collects, they never pay." He was right about them. But he had underestimated the power of the legacy he had paid forward. She had collected the debt that was owed, but in doing so, she had created something far greater, a new beginning, built not on theft and arrogance, but on justice and grace. The battle was over. The city no longer felt like an enemy to be conquered, but a home to be built, and she had finally truly found her peace. And so the story of Victoria Lancaster isn't just about a divorce. It's a modern-day epic of justice, legacy, and the surprising power of a quiet truth in a world that screams. She walked into that courtroom, a pregnant wife seeking a fair settlement, and walked out the unexpected leader of an empire, a testament to the fact that real strength isn't about the noise you make, but the foundations you stand on. What do you think would have happened if she never found that file? Could you have been as brave as Victoria? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If this story of resilience and hidden power resonated with you, please hit that like button. Share it with someone who needs to hear that it's never too late for the truth to win, and make sure you subscribe for more real-life dramas that are stranger and more inspiring than fiction. Thank you for listening.